TV debate turns into scandal as Jasmine Crockett outs Miller's marital collapse live. It only took one question. Just 23 words spoken in a voice that didn't rise, didn't crack, didn't even tremble, and the entire room collapsed. The clip wouldn't show the lead up. Not really. Most people wouldn't even remember the immigration debate, the policy graphs, the polling data. All of that dissolved the second Representative Jasmine Crockett tilted her head, met Stephen Miller's eyes across the studio, and said, "You want to talk about family values, Stephen? Maybe start with why your wife left you and took the kids 6 months ago." The silence was immediate and surgical. Not the soft, uncomfortable kind of silence, the kind that comes when someone says something too close to the bone and nobody knows how to recover. No. This was the kind of silence that ripped oxygen from the air. Cameras didn't pan. Studio lights didn't flicker. Even the floor manager stopped breathing. And Stephen Miller. He blinked once. Then again. His jaw didn't drop, it locked. The muscles in his face moved like someone trying to do math while drowning. And for just a moment behind his eyes, you could see the panic blooming. This wasn't debate prep. This wasn't the usual media jab and duck routine. This was something raw, something real. A mic was still hot. Of course it was. Mics are always hot when they shouldn't be. You arrogant lying. He began jabbing a finger toward her like he was pointing to a broken machine. Jasmine didn't flinch. "You brought up families, Stephen," she said calmly, the way a parent might point out a fire behind a child holding a lighter. "I just asked a question." Moderators scrambled. One stammered, "We're going to cut to a break," as if saying it enough times would make it happen faster. But the director was already 4 seconds too slow. And that was all it took. On screen, the last thing America saw before the commercial was Stephen Miller rising halfway out of his chair, breath caught in his throat, before muttering 5 words loud enough to register, but soft enough to sound like rot. "You people are trash." It was unedited, it was undeniable, and it was everywhere within minutes. But that came later. Back inside the Tempe studio, back in the moment, the chaos didn't hit all at once. It unraveled in waves. Behind the glass in the control room, lead producer Pete Langston slammed his headset on the console. "What the hell just happened?" he barked, not at anyone in particular, just at the world, at the timeline, at fate. One tech, pale eyes glued to a playback monitor, whispered, "It's already on X." Screen recorded, captioned, "It's out." Stephen Miller had disappeared off-set, storming into the green room. The door slammed. An intern dropped their clipboard. Another texted Pete immediately. "He's threatening a lawsuit. Says she defamed him. Wants a retraction on air." In the hallway, Jasmine was still sitting exactly where she had been moments before. Unbothered, still. Like the eye of a hurricane that had just leveled a coast. She picked up her phone, typed one message, and hit send. No panic, no second guess. In her calm, the truth landed harder. Outside the studio, students had already gathered college kids, political junkies, locals who'd heard something had gone down. The rumors were immediate and wild that Stephen had hit a producer, that Jasmine had leaked divorce papers on air, that someone fainted during the break. None of it was true. But none of it mattered either. The narrative had already slipped from their hands. It was viral now. Not because it was sensational, but because it was surgical. Because someone finally said what wasn't supposed to be said. Inside, a junior producer asked a question that silenced the control room again. How did she know? That was the thing, wasn't it? It wasn't just that Jasmine dropped a personal bombshell. It was that she dropped the right one at the exact moment with exactly zero fear. It wasn't anger. It wasn't vindictive. It was clarity. Like pulling back a curtain that everyone had politely agreed not to notice. And the collapse wasn't loud. That's what made it brutal. Because Stephen Miller wasn't just a man on stage, he was an idea, a persona, a narrative that had been carefully built over a decade of cable news hits and think tank panels and polished anger. And in one breath, Jasmine Crockett flipped it over like a photo frame, hiding something ugly behind it. The break finally came clumsy, late jarring. The cameras cut, the lights dimmed, and the crew stared at each other like survivors after an earthquake trying to decide whether to flee or rebuild. But the moment was already out there. By the time Jasmine left the stage, 5 separate clips had hit X. TikTok had dozens. Instagram reels were captioning her face with knockout bell sounds and quotes like, "This wasn't a mic drop. The mic was just on. Silence lost today. Clarity won." Back in the green room, Miller was pacing like a caged animal. He yelled at a production assistant without looking up. "She's done. You hear me? I want her off the air. I want a written apology. I want..." He knocked over a chair. No one stopped him. In another part of the building, senior producer Danica Bell was already on the phone with legal. One lawyer said she made a personal allegation that could trigger a standards complaint. Danica didn't blink. He melted down. On national television. That's not on us. And in Jasmine's dressing room, silence. She didn't pace. She didn't scroll. She just sat, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady. She knew this wasn't the end of the fight, but it was the end of a lie. Because sometimes truth doesn't come with sirens or applause. Sometimes it comes wrapped in a question so clean, so surgical, it cuts a decade of performance clean in half. And the blood it draws isn't red. It's reputation. And Stephen Miller was bleeding out. The reputation was bleeding, but Stephen Miller still thought he could bandage it with threats. He didn't realize yet this wasn't a paper cut. It was an artery. The dressing room door slammed behind him with enough force to rattle the light bulbs in the mirror. A chair lay on its side. An intern outside flinched as Stephen's voice cracked through the door, barking orders no one was going to follow. In the control room, Pete Langston watched 3 monitors at once. One showing replays. One showing social media. One showing his own face in the studio's live delay. "We're the story now," he muttered. Danica Bell didn't answer. She was on the phone with the head of standards compliance, her voice clipped. She didn't state it as fact, she said. She asked a question. If he chose to melt down like a bad transmission, that's on him. Pete cut in. "The internet doesn't care about clauses. We're already trending." He tapped his screen. Clip Jasmine, still as stone. Voice calm. "Maybe start with why your wife left you." Clip Stephen, voice climbing. "You people are trash." Clip the silence after pure, uncut tension. A cultural vacuum sucking everyone in. That was the moment no spin doctor could unspin. And yet, in the green room, Stephen was still trying to flex the muscles of a persona that no longer worked. "I want a statement," he snarled, "from the network. Denouncing her. Tonight." The assistant didn't respond. He just left and sent a single message. He's still screaming. Wants retraction? Threatening defamation? Meanwhile, across the building, Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't even raise her pulse. Her aide, Nico, called. "You good?" Jasmine looked out the window at the parking lot below. "Never better. You hit harder than I thought." She asked for it. "You think he's going to walk out?" "I think he already has." Outside, the crowd had doubled. Students, locals. One guy in a Bernie shirt, another in a MAGA hat, oddly quiet. Rumors were growing legs. Did Miller call her a slur? Did Jasmine pull court records live? Was it scripted? It wasn't. That's what made it lethal. Because Jasmine hadn't come with theatrics. She came with the truth. And that's always more dangerous when it's unscripted. Inside, the studio scrambled to pivot. Pete flipped cue cards with shaking fingers. "We can't put them back together," he said. "That would be a live grenade." An assistant asked, "Bring in the backup panels." "No." "We go cold." Miles resets. Keep it neutral. We are not apologizing. Danica looked up. If we cave now, we're complicit. And they were right. Because outside of the building, beyond the studio, beyond the chaos, the internet had already declared it an event. 89 seconds after the segment aired, a college student in Mesa uploaded a 15-second clip to X. Caption: What did Steven just say to her? Within an hour, 600,000 views. By morning, 5 million. TikTok responded faster than cable news. One clip looped Jasmine's face with boxing bell sound effects. Another recreated the scene with puppets. One creator edited in a Mortal Kombat-style finish him just as Steven stood up. It was absurd. And yet, it was precise. Because in those 15 seconds, a decade of political branding unraveled. Stephen Miller, the architect, the strategist, the unflinching conservative, replaced by the man who lost his cool because someone spoke the one truth he couldn't deny. Reddit exploded. A top thread titled Jasmine Crockett just nuked Stephen Miller's whole image on live TV. Over 4,000 comments followed. She had receipts. No way she says that unless she knows. This wasn't petty. It was personal and precise. Others dug deeper. Within 2 hours, old court records surfaced. Divorce filings, school withdrawal forms, speculative timelines, nothing confirmed. But no one cared. Because silence when shattered creates noise, people believe even if it isn't complete. By midnight, conservative networks were already spinning. She crossed the line. She weaponized personal pain. She assassinated character. But none of them said the other thing, the thing louder than any headline. Stephen didn't deny it. Not in tweets, not in interviews, not even in a half-baked press release. And silence in crisis is a confession by omission. Back inside, Jasmine left the studio quietly. No entourage, no grand exit. Just a text from Nico as she stepped into her SUV. Miles just pivoted, said they're moving the show on without either of you. She replied, "Good. They're not the story anymore." And she was right. Because at that moment, the clip wasn't just viral, it was infrastructure. Uploaded, downloaded, remixed, subtitled, overdubbed. Even late-night comedians were scrambling. One joked, Stephen Miller learned the hard way you can lie about your policies, but you can't lie about your family when the mic's still hot. That line got a standing ovation. But the most brutal commentary came not from satirists, but from silence. Cara Delaney, Stephen's estranged wife. No tweets, no statements, no denials. Just a private text sent to a close friend after the clip went viral. 5 words I never thought she'd say it. She didn't mean it bitterly, not with anger, just truth. Because some things, when finally said, feel like oxygen returning to the room. But Jasmine wasn't done yet. Not publicly, not privately. Because in her inbox, time-stamped 3 days before the debate, was a single email. No subject line. No body text. Just a screenshot. An email thread. Between 2 names she didn't know. CD and RW. Last message read, he hasn't seen the kids in 42 days. Not because of court orders, he just stopped showing up. She stared at it for a full minute, then forwarded it to Nico. His reply, do we verify this or leave it alone? She didn't answer. Not yet. Because that wasn't just gossip. That was motive. That was pattern. That was the beginning of a reckoning. And what Stephen Miller didn't know yet was that this wasn't about a single moment on live TV. It was about how many people had been waiting for anyone to finally say it out loud. And Jasmine. She wasn't done speaking. She wasn't done speaking, but she knew better than to speak too soon. The email still sat in her inbox. The subject line remained blank. The attachment still glowed on the screen like a matchstick in a dark tunnel. Jasmine had read it again. Then again. Then again. He hasn't seen the kids in 42 days. She didn't forward it to the press. She didn't leak it to an ally. She didn't screenshot it with a cryptic caption. No hashtags, no threads. She waited. Because some bombs detonate louder if you let them tick. But Jasmine wasn't the only one reading in silence. 3 states away, in a modest adobe house in Tempe, Cara Delaney, the woman everyone was suddenly asking about sat with her phone in her hand, watching the clip for the 4th time. She hadn't planned to. She had been ignoring calls all day, turning off notifications, burying herself in photo folders of her kids, but curiosity has a way of breaking through fortresses. On the screen, she saw her ex-husband's face fold inwards. Rage, fighting shame. Evasion crumbling under exposure. And then Jasmine's voice, calm, unforgiving, clean. Cara pressed pause. Her hand was trembling. Not from fear, from something deeper. Recognition. She didn't cry. She didn't pace. She didn't scream, finally, like in the movies. Instead, she opened her notes app and typed 9 words. I never thought someone would actually say it. Then she sent it. One recipient, Marissa Lang, her old college roommate. No greeting. Just the clip. And that line. Marissa called immediately. Cara didn't answer. Instead, she opened a new document and began typing. Not a press release. Not an op-ed. Not a tell-all. A letter. To no one in particular. But meant for everyone who had ever doubted her silence. She didn't write it in one sitting. It took hours. A glass of red wine, 2 drafts she deleted, and 1 paragraph that made her stop and shake. She didn't include dates. She didn't name call. There were no threats, no legal jargon. Just truths. Sharp, quiet, and devastating. He never hit me. But he erased me. 1 comment at a time. 1 outfit rejected. 1 locked door. 1 sigh when I asked for time. 1, you're remembering that wrong, after every argument. It was all quiet. Until I realized my children had begun to wait by the window, hoping he'd show. And I knew what I had to do. She sent the final version to 3 friends and her lawyer. All of them asked, are you sure she was? The letter was under 800 words, but it was an earthquake in prose. And it leaked before dawn. The site that posted it first didn't even put it in bold fonts or dramatic headlines. They just ran the letter with a caption, these are Cara Delaney's words, that's all. That was all anyone needed. Cable news clipped it by noon. Some anchors read it aloud like a eulogy. Others treated it like a manifesto. One network, a conservative one, tried to dismiss it as the politicization of personal heartbreak. But the hashtag had already trended for 6 hours. Not just a family man. Crockett was right. Silence is a cage. Jasmine didn't repost the letter. Didn't quote it. Didn't even reference it directly. But her office received over 1,000 emails in the next 24 hours. 1 line appeared again and again. Thank you for not letting it slide. Stevens Camp nothing. No statement. No denial. Not even a counter-accusation. His silence became its own form of confirmation. But it wasn't just the public reacting. Behind the scenes, things were unraveling. 2 former aides came forward off the record. One told a mid-tier journalist everyone knew. He controlled the office like he controlled his home. You wore colors he didn't like. You got reassigned. Too many questions. You got frozen out. Another aide who had been let go for communication conflicts shared this. He once told a staffer to change her shirt because the pattern was visually chaotic. He didn't mean distracting. He meant she didn't look manageable. They didn't go public with names. They didn't have to. Because this wasn't just a story about a man whose family walked out. This was about the illusion of control cracking. Stephen Miller had spent years building an image of strength, composure, strategy, icy focus. But now, all anyone could see was the man who exploded when confronted with the one thing he couldn't spin. His wife's silence wasn't weakness. It was containment. Now broken, and the fragments cut deep. A day after the letter leaked, Kara made her first public appearance. Not on television, not on a podcast, not at a press conference. She went to a PTA meeting in Mesa. She asked about book lists, curriculum updates, cafeteria changes, but everyone in the room knew who she was. One mother approached afterward, quiet, cautious. "Are you really her?" Kara smiled softly. "I'm just here for the books." And she meant it. Because even after the exposure, the headlines, the trending threads, she hadn't burned anything down. She had simply stopped protecting the structure that was already collapsing. Back in D.C., Jasmine's team met to review security protocol. 2 of her town hall sponsors had pulled out. One donor had paused a fundraiser. Her inbox was flooded with threats, some graphic, some just vulgar. But then Nico showed her the message that made her stop. "I left a man like that 12 years ago. Nobody believed me until I stopped explaining. You didn't owe us anything, but you gave us everything." "Thank you." She didn't reply, but she wrote the words on a yellow Post-it and stuck it inside her planner. Just 4 words. "You didn't owe us." And in that moment she knew. This wasn't a hit job. It wasn't a personal vendetta. It wasn't below the belt. It was a mirror. And Stephen Miller. He was the one who smashed it. Not with his words, but with his silence. Stephen Miller had shattered the mirror and then disappeared from the room. Not literally. He was still alive, still pacing halls in Scottsdale hotel suites, still calling lawyers who didn't pick up fast enough, still sending messages that began with "draft me a response," but ended in ellipses. But publicly, he had vanished. No podcast, no Fox segment, no column in The Federalist. Just silence. And silence from a man like Stephen Miller wasn't strategy anymore. It was a symptom. Because silence used to serve him, it used to be a weapon. The kind of stillness that commanded rooms and unsettled panels, the pause before a venomous quip, the breath before a brutal pivot. It used to be his edge. Now it was a vacuum. And America was filling it for him. The memes didn't stop. The hashtags didn't slow. Even comedians who had never once mentioned his name were now running cold opens with punchlines like, "If you're going to call someone trash, maybe make sure your mic's not live and your life's not leaking." Cable pundits split into 2 camps. One called it a character assassination. The other called it finally catching the character on tape. And still, Stephen said nothing. Because what do you say when your entire brand has imploded not with a lie, but with a truth you spent years hiding behind soundproof walls? It wasn't just about Jasmine anymore, or Kara, or the kids. It was about the people watching people who had seen themselves in the unraveling. One columnist from Detroit wrote, "This wasn't a debate moment. This was a live exorcism of political hypocrisy." Another more surgical, "The only thing Stephen Miller hates more than immigrants is being held to the moral standards he lectures about." In quiet corners, conservative circles started whispering. At a steakhouse in Georgetown, 2 senior communications directors swapped whiskey and regret. "He's spiraling," one said. "Used to be the guy with the plan. Now he's locked in a hotel room, watching his name rot in real time." "Someone should have warned him," the other muttered. But no one had. Because Stephen Miller had spent years cultivating obedience, not loyalty. The difference loyalty protects. Obedience just watches, and they were watching him unravel. Meanwhile, Kara filed for sole custody in Maricopa County. No press conference, no morning show tour, just a clean, deliberate filing, emotional neglect. Controlling behavior. Inconsistent, unsafe communication with children. That line alone sent ripples through every legal analysis podcast in the country. Stephen's legal team didn't respond. His PR firm tried to ghost their own client. Sponsors pulled out from a documentary project. His name was quietly removed from a donor event invite in Tampa. On X1, users summarized it best: Stephen Miller built a career yelling about broken homes, then lost everything trying to pretend his wasn't one. And through it all, Jasmine Crockett stayed silent. Not because she was retreating, but because she didn't need to speak. The world was still echoing with the words she'd already said. Instead, she went to work. Infrastructure committee meetings, local housing summit, a bill co-sponsored for public education equity. And when a journalist at a radio interview asked her how she felt about the fallout, she didn't flinch. "I didn't do it to go viral," she said. "I did it because I got tired of letting silence win." There was no applause in the studio, just the heavy pause that follows a truth too sharp to clap for. But while Jasmine was moving forward, the storm behind her was still building, not just around Stephen, but around the entire machine that built him. Because when one mask falls, others start to slip. Two women, former aides to prominent conservative figures, reached out to a small but tenacious political reporter. They didn't talk about Stephen directly, but their stories followed the same script: undermined, silenced, isolated, dismissed, controlled in tone and color and opinion, expected to smile next to power while power rewrote their worth. The article ran under a quiet headline: "Behind the Podium, What We Were Told to Swallow." It didn't trend, but it rippled. Community organizers picked it up. Feminist newsletters quoted it. Debate teams dissected it in college classrooms. Because people were ready to talk, not just about Stephen Miller, but about the ecosystem that allowed him to thrive. And Kara. She didn't respond to media requests. She didn't grant interviews. She didn't sit down with Oprah or Anderson or anyone else. But she sent Jasmine something. A printed copy of her letter. Folded, neat, no extras, no dedications. Tucked inside a small blank card. One sentence written in clean cursive: "Thank you for not letting it slide." Jasmine didn't frame it. She didn't tweet it. She just slid it into the side pocket of her work bag and carried on with her day. Because she knew this wasn't the end of anything. It was the middle of something bigger. And she was ready for whatever came next. She slid the card into her bag, not as a trophy, not as a warning, but as a reminder: the truth once spoken doesn't require repetition. It simply travels. And it did. From a whisper in a studio hallway to a headline in a major daily. From a 15-second clip on TikTok to panel discussions on primetime news. From Kara's private truth to public policy questions. Jasmine didn't plan it this way. She didn't light the match to burn a man down. She lit it because she was done sitting in the dark. And now others were stepping into the light too. The card from Kara wasn't the only quiet message she received that week. Dozens of handwritten letters poured into her DC office. Most were unsigned. Some came with photos of kids, family dogs, women smiling, but tired. One note simply read, "He told me I imagined it too." Jasmine didn't reply to them all. She couldn't. But she read every single one, and with each sentence, she saw the story expanding beyond Stephen, beyond Kara, beyond even herself. Because when a woman speaks the truth, it's news. But when thousands speak, it becomes momentum. The media at first tried to pivot. They chased the next scandal, the next outburst, the next fire to put on screen. But the story refused to vanish. Stephen Miller still holed up in a Scottsdale resort, watched his name dissolve from relevance, not with a bang, but a slow, humiliating fade. One grainy photo surfaced him alone at an outdoor table. No phone, no expression, just still. A caption on Reddit nailed it. "This is what happens when the mask slips and there's nothing underneath." His allies were scrambling. A few conservative pundits tried to reframe the debate, claiming Stephen's downfall was the result of radical leftist emotional warfare. Others called Jasmine a media manipulator who weaponized family trauma. But that narrative wasn't sticking anymore. Because even among conservative-leaning voters, something had shifted. One anonymous strategist leaked results from a recent focus group. His favorability dropped like a rock, not because of the divorce, but because of the silence. Because he didn't own it. Because he looked guilty as hell. And in the corridors of influence, silence is a vacuum. The second a man who built his persona on fire and fury retreats into shadow, the perception becomes reality. Even some donors, his most loyal supporters, began to murmur. "I'm done defending this guy," one was overheard saying at a fundraising dinner in Houston. "He made his bed. Now he's mad it's cold." Meanwhile, Kara continued her quiet revolution. She enrolled in a master's program in education policy. She volunteered twice a week at a local women's advocacy center in Tempe. She spoke at a closed-door event for survivors of emotional abuse, not as Stephen Miller's ex, but as Cara Delaney educator mother woman who refused to stay quiet. She still didn't say his name, not once. But her words were louder than any headline. Silence isn't always peace. Sometimes it's just a different kind of cage. That quote made its way to college classrooms, to therapist offices, to Instagram stories captioned with, "This, just this." Back in D.C., Jasmine returned to the work she'd always done: committee sessions, town hall planning, legislative strategy. But she wasn't the same. Neither was her party. What started as a viral moment had become a catalyst. Young organizers cited her in campaign training sessions. Debate teams used her segment as a case study in unscripted political precision. Even centrist Democrats began invoking her name, not as a firebrand, but as a mirror holder. She didn't tell people what to believe. She showed them who was talking, and people listened. Not everyone praised her. The backlash still lived in the comment sections, the op-eds, the whispered strategy meetings, but none of it reached her the same way anymore. Because truth once spoken with purpose stops needing validation. But Stephen? He still hadn't spoken. Not publicly, not privately, not even to the court. Kara's filing for sole custody proceeded without obstruction. His legal team offered no resistance. No modifications, just a quiet signature. And with it, the last performance ended. The man who once controlled narratives, silenced opposition, and dictated messaging with a surgical tongue, now reduced to footnotes in a letter he never thought would exist. And Jasmine, she never brought him up again. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not even offhanded. Because when you end a lie, you don't need to retell it. The country had already filled in the blanks. But the impact wasn't just on the national stage. It was in every quiet room where someone had once been told to calm down, be nicer, be quieter. It was in the silence that had ruled for too long. And now, it was being replaced by voices. Clear, direct, unapologetic. Because Jasmine had proven something that couldn't be unlearned. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do to a bully is tell the truth before they get the last word. The bully didn't get the last word. He didn't even get a chance to respond. By the time the final court documents were filed, by the time his name disappeared from donor lists, speaking rosters, and PR blurbs, Stephen Miller had become a case study, not a combatant. A punchline in political satire. A ghost in a tailored suit. And that perhaps was the most brutal ending of all. Not public execution. Not righteous downfall. But irrelevance. Meanwhile, the echo of truth kept moving. It moved in campus classrooms where a gender studies professor rewrote her midterm module to include Jasmine Crockett's debate moment as a primary text under rhetorical ruptures. It moved in women's shelters, where staff replayed the clip not to laugh, but to explain. This is what naming it looks like. It moved in living rooms, where mothers watched the footage with teenage daughters, and said for the first time, "That's what I felt too." It even reached Capitol Hill quietly at first. A whisper in corridors, a shift in tone, a new caution in the way some men phrased family values at the podium. Because now they knew someone might be listening, and someone might be ready. Jasmine Crockett had not destroyed Stephen Miller. She had simply refused to let him stand above the fire while pretending he hadn't poured the gas. And more than anything, she had survived it. That was the final shock. Not the blow, but the fact she walked through it untouched by shame, heavier in reputation, lighter in burden. Some said she was lucky. Others said she was ruthless. But the women who wrote her, the people who thanked her, they said she was something else. Unapologetically necessary. She didn't change overnight. She didn't turn into a media darling or the centerpiece of every liberal campaign. But she became something more enduring. Proof. Proof that one voice, when unshaken, could make a nation pause, then reflect, then reconsider. In a closed-door meeting a month later, a young House member paused during a discussion on communication strategy and said, "We need to stop writing around the truth." Crockett didn't. And the world didn't fall apart. It listened. No one argued. Because they couldn't. The results were in. Voter engagement on her website had spiked 600% in 3 weeks. Her approval rating among independents had climbed. And perhaps most tellingly, the attacks had quieted. They hadn't vanished. But they had dimmed. The usual loud performative opposition began pulling punches because they realized something Stephen hadn't. Once you try to silence someone and they speak anyway, you don't scare them anymore. Meanwhile, Cara Delaney became a fixture in her community. Not as a political figure, but as a lighthouse. She spoke at a school board meeting in Mesa on curriculum funding. No cameras, no viral tweets. But her presence alone drew quiet nods of solidarity. A local mom hugged her after the meeting. "You made space for people like me," she whispered. Cara smiled. "I didn't make space," she said. "I just stopped pretending I didn't need it." Across the country, her letter lived on. In classrooms, in HR workshops, in family court consultations, lines quoted, paragraphs analyzed, a section of it. Silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's just a cage was printed and pinned above a therapist's desk in Des Moines. It didn't make her a saint. She didn't want that. But it made her real in a world full of masks. And Stephen, he remained silent. Not out of dignity, not out of strategy, but because he had finally learned what silence felt like when no one feared it anymore. His podcast lost its final sponsor. His name became shorthand for deflection. "Don't Miller," this staffers whispered to one another before going on air. Even former allies refused to reference him publicly. One strategist said it cleanly in a leaked group text. He built a fortress out of control. Jasmine walked through it with a mirror. And now the walls are ash. But the real legacy wasn't about him. It was about everyone else. About the aides who finally reported mistreatment. The interns who rewrote their exit letters. The daughters who turned to their mothers and said, "Did Dad ever..." It was about the people who finally saw that calling out hypocrisy wasn't cruelty. It was clarity. In a late-night interview, when asked how she stayed so composed, Jasmine just smiled and said, "I've been swallowing silence for years. That night, I just chose to stop." And then she went back to work. She didn't run for higher office yet. She didn't write a book. She didn't center herself in the fallout. Because she knew something that too many forget. The goal isn't to go viral. The goal is to make it safer for the next person who speaks. In a final full circle moment, months later, Jasmine received another envelope in her office. Inside was a small folded photo, Cara and her 2 kids smiling at a science fair. On the back, written in careful handwriting, "We're okay now. Thank you." Jasmine didn't cry. She didn't frame it either. She slipped it beside the card Cara had sent, before Zip the bag closed and left for her next committee meeting. And somewhere in the distance, across offices, homes, schools, shelters, courtrooms, a voice rang louder than ever. It wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the thousands who heard her, saw her, and finally said, "Me too. Now I'll speak."